Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast. I'm here today with Hobie Tam, one of the founders of Oro Muscles. So, Hobie, I think we've got a really interesting conversation kind of teed up for us here, touching on EMG and what your device is doing differently and what utility that's going to have for powerlifters. That's my audience, but powerlifters specifically, and then athletes more broadly. But before we get into that, I'd like to introduce everybody to you, what your background has been in sport and how you came to be doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, I guess I'll just start with my strength journey. I think when I was in school, I used to wrestle, and then I used to do judo in grad school, and I used to get beat a lot. And so I was like any other bro, I said, "Hey, what's something I can do to, because if you get beat a lot in a combat sport, it's okay. I just need to get stronger and faster. Forget technique." That's the mind of a 20-year-old. And so I said, well, let me try this. Let me lift some weights, put on some muscle, and see where that goes. And it actually turned out really well. I was in grad school at the time, and I said, and it was a sport that I could do at 5 a.m. or I could lift in the evening. It didn't matter. So I could just show up at the gym, just lift, get my sets in. And I actually started to like powerlifting a lot. And so I lifted, it was like my lifetime goal to just at that point in time, every 165-pound dude wanted to pull 500 pounds. And so that was like, I just followed that trend. And I said, okay, if I pull 500, it means that I'm strong. It took me a good 6-7 years to pull 500. And then at the end of that, I was like, okay, I'm done. This is as strong as I need to get. And then I drank the Kool-Aid of just switching to Olympic weightlifting. That's my relationship with lifting, and I've been lifting ever since. So it's probably been about 9-10 years of lifting. And now I also drank the Kool-Aid of endurance training. And I moved to the Netherlands, and there wasn't a gym. And then I said, okay, let me try this cardio thing. And that's when I dropped Olympic weightlifting and went straight to running an ultra marathon. We ran like a 40-mile race. That was horrible. I don't recommend it, or at least have a nice transition. That's kind of my background with sports and training. I've tried pretty much every sport or every training regimen to get strong underneath the sun that allowed me to do. So I actually watched a lot of YouTube back in 2012, a lot of Omar Isov, Westside Barbell, Thrall, a lot of Mike Ishertal, just all those kind of like YouTube hubs. I just try to get as much bro science as possible and try to just implement it. And that's kind of my relationship with fitness. And then back in 2016, how Oro Muscle started was, again, I was sitting in graduate school. I have an engineering background, systems and engineering. And some friends and I, we were watching a basketball game just randomly. In this basketball game, I think it was an Elite Eight game. We were watching this rerun, and a player came down with a rebound and broke his leg in half on national television. And nobody touched him. It was just like the straw that broke the camel's back type situation. And we said, okay, with all of our technology, that shouldn't happen, because to us, that was like, okay, this might have been preventable. Like there wasn't any acute trauma. It was just probably a bunch of overload many times for a long period of time. And that's what caused this eventual break. And it was a nasty compound fracture, bone through the skin. They cut immediately to commercials. And so we said, like any good engineers, we bought a case of beer, went online, bought some sensors, and we literally just made a prototype over the next couple of days. And back then it was just like this kind of one-off kind of project. Okay, this is what they do when they get bored, very stereotypical. But at the end of it, the other guys had a lot more grad school to go. But I said, hey, I'm graduating. I think there's a use case here, because the question was essentially, can we build a sensor system or sensor array out of existing sensors where we can detect deviations in movement, and we can look at those deviations and correlate them with maybe, hey, are you about to get injured? Are you overtraining? And what I saw was, hey, can we put this on stroke rehabilitation patients or Parkinson's patients and start to understand their symptoms better and better direct rehabilitation? So that's like the idea. And then once I graduated, I called a friend and I knew that she hated her life in Boston and she couldn't wait to quit her job. And it was also a friend that I could trust. And so those are the types of friends you want to start companies with. And so I called her. She put in her 2 weeks notice, drove 16 hours down from Boston to Clemson, South Carolina, where I was doing graduate school. And we started the company. And for about 18 months, we spun our wheels. We tried to get this medical use case going, and it really didn't go anywhere. We were able to get good prototypes and get a good proof of concept, but no one was really biting in terms of a customer or even a first adopter. And without that, like you don't have the chicken or the egg. So the investment doesn't really come. And that's actually why I moved to the Netherlands, is because we literally just Googled healthcare accelerators, and we found an accelerator program that would accept us in the northern part of the Netherlands, of all places. It had a medical university attached to it, to this big University of Groningen, and it had a big medical center. And so we went there for a year, and we ended up I stayed there for 4.5 years before I recently moved back to the US. And during that time, we actually found a much better sensor manufacturer. So instead of becoming like a sensor maker, we actually now focus more on the software. We just buy. Turns out it's really hard to make a really good clinical grade medical technology. And someone else already made a really good sensor. And we said, it's pointless to compete with them. And we want to do more of the software analytics and work closer to the customer anyway. And so we just partnered with them. We buy the sensors from them. They're clinical grade. They detect movement and muscle excitation patterns through electromyography, or EMG. And we essentially put the sensor on people and we detect muscle excitation, much like EMGs that are used in the clinic. And then, but the technology is getting really good now, where the signal's very clean. We are able to filter out movement artifacts, and we have an onboard movement sensor as well. So what we can do is we can map muscle excitation patterns onto movement patterns. And we can say, okay, this movement pattern, this had this performance outcome, and this was the almost like neural effort or neuromuscular excitation required to do it. So if we think about modeling muscles like car engines, efficiency is defined as, okay, it took this much gas to go this much distance. A really efficient car can take a small amount of gas and go a really long way. An inefficient car takes a lot of gas to go a very short distance. And wrapped up within that is, okay, horsepower, how fast did you get to the destination? And that's how you kind of diversify between all the different types of cars. Muscles work the same way. And so when we're looking at athlete types and what is required to do a sport, we just fell into this use case. We were going after the medical device market, but the first people actually willing to use this type of service was athletes, because they wanted to improve performance. And when we circled back, I started powerlifting, never thinking that I would ever need my fellow bros in the gym to test something out for a company. But it's really weird how it all kind of circled back. So now we use the sensor system right now we put these sensors on athletes, and we look at their movement efficiency and what was the muscle patterning to actually get that performance. And we start to look at deviations. Can we do load monitoring? We're answering a lot of fundamental questions, which we'll get into later on in this podcast. But that's essentially what we do right now, is we focus on muscle guided training. So instead of assuming a lot of stuff about what the muscle's doing, put a sensor on and say, hey, what is the muscle actually doing? And then we use that data to program or make interventions or try to debug what's happening inside of an athlete.
Yeah, that makes sense. So considering that your device makes heavy use of what's at core and EMG technology, you already touched on it a bit, but I'm thinking, like, for people who are not super familiar with what EMG is, what is it telling us? Maybe we should talk about that for a minute, and we can then touch on what makes, like, why the oral muscles device isn't merely EMG.
Yeah. So EMG is essentially detecting a voltage difference between two areas on your skin. And the assumption is underneath that skin is a muscle that is using a voltage difference to contract. And so if we put the EMG right above, let's say this is my bicep, right on the belly of the bicep here, essentially we can tell if the muscle is in contraction or not. And we can start to look at, okay, is it just ramping up? Is it approaching peak? Or is it peak, like a lot of effort? And so there's varying amounts of resolution we can say, where we can put into the bucket, okay, is it just background noise? Is it ramping up? Is it peaking? And then we can start to talk about how intense that muscle is. The sensor data itself, we've tested a lot with coaches and even clinicians. The sensor data itself is actually not that useful. It's the interpretation of that data. And that's where Oral Muscles really focuses on is, okay, we take this data. It's like crazy amount of data. How can we distill it down into, let's say, 5 or 6 numbers that will tell you, okay, should I increase load? Should I decrease load? Should I increase volume? Should I decrease volume? Are these movements fruitful for my training goals? And so specifically what our analytics does is it takes the muscle pattern and it compares it with other muscle patterns and movements throughout your workout. And we can look at the 2 hardest to measure metrics that factor into training stimulus, and that's specificity and intensity. So load, volume, and frequency are easy. Like you can track that with pen and paper, but specificity and intensity are really difficult to track. And we use this data from the muscle to really look at how specific is a movement. If you do 10 reps of competition bench versus a really heavy, close to 1 rep max, 2 reps on 1-inch board press, which is more specific? It's also asking, like, okay, you can do marathon running, but you could also do sprinting. Those are both running, but you would never say that marathon running is specific to sprinting. Much like, why would we say more than 5 reps on bench is sport specific to competition bench? It has a time and place. I'm not saying that's bad or good. It just has its own time and place in your program. And essentially our data can help you determine, okay, am I doing the right specificity and intensity given the interval or phase that I'm in my training season? So if you're peaking, you want high intensity and high specificity. Or we can actually validate, are those movements inside of your training really specific, and are they really that intense? We've also done a couple studies where we look at athletes and how they move differently. And we can also trace assumptions to, is the athlete actually moving the way the coach thinks they're moving? And is the training stimulus actually reaching the part of the body that the coach believes or assumes so?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to start touching on specificity. Specificity is one of these things that the common understanding of it is a pretty rudimentary understanding, I think. Like, it's just vaguely visual. Does this kind of look like the movement that you're doing in competition or not? And then some people will layer on intensity on top of that. And I've done this in seminar presentations and stuff like that as well, where you do need to consider the rep range. But speaking of you being in the Netherlands, something that Franz Bosch points out that I think is right on target is that there's so many dimensions to specificity that it's not clear to me how it would ever be distilled down to a single number, or even like a single idea. That there's dimensions to it, right? Like, you could have something, say we're powerlifters and we care about bench pressing. You could have something be fairly specific to the chest muscles, but not specific to the triceps. So it's specific and not specific at the same time, depending on what you're focused on. You could have a movement be specific to the muscles, but not to the energy systems, or specific to the skill, but not the muscles. That one would be a little bit more difficult, but you get the idea that there's dimensions to it, and that to some degree they can be decoupled. And that's one thing that I thought was really cool from maybe skipping ahead a little bit, but in the data that you and I collected together, when we started looking at some of the details there and some of the stuff that we were learning, was when we zeroed in on triceps in the bench press after a fairly short while. So we're focused on that, like what movements are most specific for the triceps. And to some extent, it's what you would think, which is reassuring, right? But there were definitely some surprises in there in terms of which things were looking similar to a heavy bench press on EMG.
I'll give a really good case study on specificity and how sometimes unvalidated assumptions can really throw a wrench into things. We were testing on a speed skating team, like ice speed skating. And essentially the assumption, almost a religious assumption, was, okay, speed skating involves your legs. What builds legs? Squats. And visually, okay, it seems quite a specific movement, to the point where during the peaking cycles, 6 weeks, the World Cup and Olympics, speed skaters are religiously still squatting heavy in the low rep range. So really high intensity. And they believe that it's a specific thing to essentially keep power in the legs and be able to transfer that to speed on ice. However, when we put the sensors on, we found out that squats were actually not that specific, specifically in the subject. And then we later expanded the study and found out that, okay, across the entire team, they were not specific. And this kind of threw in a huge wrench because it's the highest risk movement. And we actually found it was counterproductive. It builds your quads, and that the net gain was that, okay, your quads get bigger and you actually slow down. So it had a net negative effect on speed. And so we said we essentially cut out squats in an elite speed skater who by chance was injured, had a back injury because he was doing heavy squats. We cut out that squat, and not only did his speed not diminish, it actually started going up to the point where he started skating close to his personal best ever in his life, close to competition. And so through that study, we really learned the power of, okay, let's start to question, why is a movement inside this training program? Is it first principles design driven? Or is it because another bro did it and that it was just passed down religiously? Not to say that bro science doesn't work. Obviously, some dudes are huge and all they use is bro science. But can we, and touches on your point, in it's not that we have all the answers. It's that now we have a more precise tool where we can get more precise measurements. And with precision and accuracy, can we lower the error margin in training plans to where we eliminate a lot of bias? For instance, in intensity, when you were talking about parsing out differences in intensity, if I squat up to a 1 rep max and I fail something, that's RPE 10. But then I did like a Metcon and essentially like as many circuits as possible until I dumped the weight with a very light weight. That technically is an RPE 10 as well. And in both scenarios, even though both were RPE 10 training programs for that day, they were RPE 10s for very different reasons. One was like an energy systems 10, and the other one was literally like my muscle can't, like the load was maxed. I can't move it anymore. And with this new type of data, we can actually look at how that actually affects the muscle, because in the Metcon RPE 10, the relative excitation levels and the work duration was like the relative excitation levels were nowhere near the intensity in terms of what we think as intensity as a 1 rep max. However, the amount of work duration and how my energy system was stressed, it was way higher than what was experienced in just like a traditional low rep max out day. So and we can see this all with one metric or one or two metrics instead of just trying to like guess with RPE or use velocity based training. And it's not to replace, but augment.
Yeah. And that's kind of where we left off, I think, right before I was about to move, is we were realizing that we could make pretty good inferences as to what RPE I was training at based on the activation pattern. And we also started to notice that, I don't know, am I wrong in saying that we could get at volume in a way? We could at least get at like volume of the contraction by looking at something like area under the curve or something similar to that. But yeah, is that accurate or awful?
Yeah, I would say that factors into kind of, what is the training stimulus? Is the RPE 10 because of intensity, load, or volume? So we can actually see that in the data. Our analytics actually looks at, it finds all the muscle contractions and then it associates all those muscle contractions with the major movements inside of each set of working out. And then we ask ourselves, okay, what is the average rep time? So almost like velocity-based training, but what's the time to complete a repetition? And what you're referring to, area underneath the curve, that's almost like, okay, how far did we go and what horsepower did we use to get there? And so that really talks about work capacity, and then the time under, almost like time under tension. That's bad phrasing. The EMG researchers are going to get mad at me at saying that, but we can look at time under tension per set, which gives an idea of volume. And we also know how many reps you did and that essentially rep speed. So we can say we can distill a lot out of this data that's really valuable to look at all these Mike Ishertal's 5 factors to training stimulus. We can look at specificity, intensity, load, volume, and frequency.
Why is time under tension off limits phraseology?
Yeah, so there's, I think EMG researchers are going to be, they're risk averse in saying that muscle excitation guarantees muscle contraction and tension. But with all the data that we've collected, we just validate use case by use case that, okay, when someone is squatting and there's the motion, like the quadricep is contracting, we visually film it. And okay, when the sensor says that the muscle is exciting, we see it physically contracting and we actually see movement. And because of this risk aversion from EMG research, or not really risk aversion, but feedback from EMG researchers, every time we work with a pilot site, we validate movement by movement that the sensor data is reliable. So we can actually say that. If you're a researcher, there may be a movement out there where we see an EMG and the muscle it might not be actually time under tension. We have to be very cautious about that.
So would that be like related to the degree of tension? So think about doing a 10 RM or something like that, where by the 10th rep, that failure mechanism is essentially that enough motor units have fatigued out that you're no longer able to generate the required amount of force to keep moving that weight. So is that an example of where you get a lot of activation but not all that much tension? Is that kind of what we're talking about?
I think it's actually much simpler than that. I think there's some literature out there that says that just because you have an EMG signal does not mean that the muscle is contracting as you think. However, our rebuttal to that is we have not been able to reproduce that. And for every movement that we found, for instance, your bench press and tricep, we have found that every time that we've seen an RMS signal from your tricep, it is heavily correlated with the load that you're moving and your muscle is indeed under tension. I think the next step in what we're trying to figure out is, which I would say that, okay, I wouldn't make that claim, is can we guess the load based on the RMS value? I don't think that is, or to put it in more simple terms, if people don't know what I'm talking about, essentially the voltage increase is what we're reading. So essentially higher voltage means that the muscle is contracting like more strongly. That's the correlation. And the assumption is, okay, does higher voltage mean a higher load being moved? I don't think we have enough data to really truly make that claim just based on how muscles work. For instance, like a power clean is probably going to elicit like really powerful, very dynamic, fast, impulsive movements to generate a much higher RMS value than, let's say, your competition bench or competition squat, which is more of a maximal strength movement. But with regards of what you're talking about, what's the relationship between what does a muscle look like as it's failing? What does it look like as the car is running out of gas? That is 100% true, is that we'll see the largest indication of increase in movement efficiency. And that's like the core metric of what we track is you have lower and lower performance outcome of the same task and higher input from your muscle, even though we're getting performance decrease. And so, for instance, yeah.
See, sorry, jumping in there, but it's super interesting, right? Because this is a thing that we've noticed for a long time now. Like in fact, the whole genesis of RPE is something along the lines of, hey, leave a rep in the tank on some of your supplemental work because you don't need to take every set to absolute failure. There's an additional recovery cost to doing that's maybe not worth it. So by stopping a rep or two short of failure, then you're able to get in more volume and train more frequently and things like that. So this is a thing that we've like colloquially noticed for a long time. And then you can speculate on why that might be. Like, why is it that last rep is more taxing? One thing that I hypothesized on before is the time under tension sort of argument that those last reps, you're generating as much force output as you can, but the rep is slower and sometimes a lot slower. And that comes with a cost associated with that as well. But then you're saying that there's like a similar phenomenon when it comes to activation, that the nervous system is essentially trying harder and harder to get anybody to activate, to get any of these motor units to turn on so that we can continue generating the required force. So it's sending like a stronger and stronger signal as that efficiency degrades. I would imagine that's taxing and that there's a fatigue cost associated with it. So it's super interesting that there's like a couple different ways that you can come to that.
Yeah, 100%. We actually have video of you doing an Amrap on the Flywheel, and essentially you start off like your excitation levels are like this in the first, let's say 7 reps, and you got a nice cadence going. We see that in the mid sensor. But as soon as the reps get slower, in the beginning, the cadence is like this, and then it starts to get stretched out like this. You start seeing your your excitation levels just blow up like this. And that's actually how we detect the difference between, okay, are you in hypertrophy work, or is this like a real working set where you're training for like maximal strength? You'll see that like an RP8 set, each rep it's definitely you're working harder and harder. However, if we see that you have in your first rep, it's this much work, and then your second rep is down here, third rep, fourth rep, fifth rep, sixth rep, we know that, okay, this is probably most likely a sub-maximal load. However, if we have a 3 or 5 rep and each bar, your movement efficiency actually goes down. So the speed and performance of the task may remain the same or go down, but the investment from the input from the body, if it constantly has to go up, we know that that's a working set. And if we know that if we tax the system too much, it will look like your AMRAP set where you fail. And then that's when you start to step into an overload. Is the progressive overload too much?
So with the Flywheel, for anybody who's maybe not familiar with the Flywheel, we're talking about Flywheel push-ups. And what's essentially going on there is that the Flywheel provides additional inertia. It's an external load. The way Flywheels feel is like starting your bike off in 10th gear. It feels a lot like that, the added inertia. It feels almost like accommodating resistance or like an isokinetic machine. It's not, because it's subject to the same kind of laws of physics that you normally would be subject to. It's just in a circular pattern instead of a linear one. So like the harder you pull on that rope, the faster the wheel is going to spin and the more it's going to accelerate. But the way the inertia is, it's stretched out. So it does feel a lot like accommodating resistance. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing that up is that even from those first few reps, you get what feels to me like maximum effort. If you just tried unloaded push-ups, you're a trained powerlifter and you try unloaded push-ups, you can't apply max force into an unloaded push-up because it's over too quickly. Before you can ramp up to maximum force output, you've already launched yourself up off the floor. It takes longer to get to max force output than it does to complete the push-up. You don't seem to have that problem with the Flywheel because it's applying this external resistance in a way that it slows you down enough. It feels like you can get to maximum force output. But then as you start to fatigue, it's still applying an inertia. And as long as you can still do a push-up, as long as you can still push your body weight, then you can keep moving. You'll just move slower and slower and slower. So it's all that to say, it's like having a built-in drop set where the weight the load that is dropped on each rep is commensurate with the level of fatigue that you're getting. So when we say I did this Flywheel push-up set for an AMRAP, it's as if you were to do like this extended drop set. So what I think is interesting, can we see the difference between, so obviously you hit this point where excitation starts to really ramp up. We can say, okay, you're really getting a lot of fatigue at that point. You're pushing into this failure zone, however we want to characterize that. Now, prior to that, if you were to do, say, a set of bench press at a submax weight, a challenging but submaximum weight, say you do 80 or 85% for a triple, that gives you a stimulus, but you don't get that fatiguing effect that we were talking about. Can you spot the difference between this but not fatigue versus we're really not getting that much stimulus to begin with? Is there a difference between those things? And like, how do you visualize that? Does that question even make sense?
Yeah, I guess the question is really asking, when is the intensity not fruitful? When does the training stimulus reach diminishing returns? That's a very difficult question to answer. I think that with more training, I think that we can start to answer that question. But right now what we focus on is let's give the coach, let's rank, okay, when your athlete does side like these 4 movements, this is what the intensity and specificities actually look like from the muscles perspective. And then we're actually arming them with a better measurement of those. We're actually still relying. So there's no way to abstract the coach from this. So we're always going to need the coach. We're relying still the coach's intuition and instinct to make that decision on whether or not that this is more intense or less intense than what they intended the program to be. However, the added value is now you actually know. You don't have to guess. And so essentially what we were talking about is the real value of all the work that we've done is this is a very powerful tool to actually diagnostically debug a training program. You have a lifter wear this through like maybe 2 or 3 maximal workouts and to get an idea of, okay, this is the training stimulus. These are the specificities, intensities between a diverse set of movements and what it looks like when the athlete is in a sub-maximal load, a power load, and then a maximal strength training load. And we can calibrate the training program based on that. And then we can also use the sensor when troubleshooting some movements that they're having trouble with. If they're to validate whether or not, okay, are you really using this muscle like we intended it to be used? For instance, we're testing with Kabuki Strength, and one of their clients, actually, this client is strong on back squat, but this client also needs to build their quads a little bit more. And so they chose accessory movements as the belt squat and the leg press to build their squats. And with the belt squat, it was really interesting because we think we actually detected fear. We actually looked at the EMG signal and we were able to actually detect sandbagging. And essentially what we found was, okay, the first rep was easy. So we saw some nice activation in the quads. Everything's normal. But then as soon as load went on, here's the peculiar thing. The rep time went down. So this client was moving the weight faster, but the muscle was not exciting as much. And so with that data, we essentially said, okay, let's see the film. And on film, the client was shunting the work to other muscle groups. And so they were not using their quads and doing the movement correctly. And so then the trainer could say, okay, this is an intervention. They made them hold a dumbbell in front of them. And so they were forced to keep their trunk upright and shunt the work back into their quads. And then the excitation went back up and the rep, when they added more weight, the load went up and the rep time went down. So we saw more working sets instead of just submaximal sets. And then the same thing with leg press. This particular client had a previous knee injury. And so they're really cautious and risk averse about using the leg press. But so we actually noticed, okay, when there's very lightweight on the leg press, there's nice activation. But as soon as more load is put on the leg press, we saw that activation go away. Same thing as the belt squat. And they said, okay, let's look at the film. And lo and behold, they're transferring the work into different muscle groups. So it's almost like there was no point in doing those accessory movements because they were not targeting what the trainer thought the muscle group was targeting. And so the trainer could use that data to say, okay, this is what you're doing. They could also point to the pictures that we produce. Hey, client, they can go through the data with the athlete. Okay, this is your activation on this set, and then this is your activation on the next set. Even though we increase the load, you're getting less training stimulus. So let's practice this intervention and let's try and do it this way so you get the right training stimulus.
Man, that's so interesting. And I think, man, it's such an obvious feather in the cap for coaching technique in supplemental exercises, communicating well with athletes for those exercises so that you're sure that you're getting the desired stimulus that they're targeting, the muscles that you want them to be targeting. I wonder how much of that accounts for some of the differences that we see. Like you have one athlete who responds really well to maybe the leg press and another athlete who doesn't respond so well to the leg press, but they do better with belt squats. Could it be subtle differences in the way that they execute those movements for various reasons that can bring about those individual differences. That's really fascinating stuff, man.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what our core mission changed as our company grew, but we essentially settled on, hey, we're making a lot of assumptions about how human movement is produced. We're essentially just trusting our eyes and our intuition and maybe our own bias, understanding how someone else is producing movement. And so this is why we phrase our value proposition as muscle guided training. Let's talk to the muscles and really ask, hey, what are you actually doing? And then use that data to actually program and create tailored programs that help specific athletes reach their goals.
Yeah, I think it's really awesome, and it's I like what you said before too about giving coaches tools to challenge the assumptions that they've made, and it's another layer to think through some of these things. I know that working with your device and just a few other tools that I've built over the years to get at some of this, what effect do you want to create? If you start thinking about the effects that you want to create in a program and then seek out ways to measure those effects, man, it's a challenging way to think about your training, but I think it's ultimately, it leads to a better place. It leads to a more effective place. It's something to think about. Is this actually having the effect that I want? Selected this exercise so that it'll strengthen my triceps. But then you do this investigation, you find out actually it's not doing that great of a job at activating my triceps. So it's unlikely that I'm going to get this great strengthening effect. Forces you to question your training philosophy a little bit. Is this actually what I want? Am I actually targeting the triceps? Or was that a story that I made to justify the inclusion of this exercise that I find valuable? What needs to change here? That I think that it causes some philosophical looks in the mirror that are really valuable. It's also like challenging work, and I think once you come out the other side of that, then you're better for it. But I won't lie that it's definitely difficult.
Yeah, it's definitely super challenging. We just have to look at the Russians and how their ascent to strength sports happened. Like back in the day, the Americans, when we lived in competition, the Russians looked at Americans. They're like, wow, look how strong the Americans are. But then they really got serious. And instead of just relying on just brute force training, they got scientific. It's okay. You are going to try these training regimens and monitor outcomes for 4 Olympic cycles. That's 16 years. Then that coach literally gets too old to coach. And then the next guy comes in. He's got to monitor outcomes for 4 Olympic cycles. And so they have 32 years of Olympics to say, okay, we got enough data, what works and what doesn't work. And over the course of 8 Olympic cycles, they really got into the science of periodization, how all these programs that we take for granted now, they're built on all of these training principles that largely common sense, but they needed the devils in the details to figure out nuance. And that's essentially what you're talking about is because if we keep on doing the same things that we're doing, we're going to reach diminishing returns. And if we want this disruption and increased performance, I think the disruption is going to come from someone sitting down and like you and a lot of thought leaders today in the strength space is what is fundamentally the bottleneck now. And to me, one area, I'm not saying that it's probably the only area, but I would say one area that we're really lacking on where if we put in 4 years into exploring this, the delta in there is probably going to be greater than any delta anywhere else is how can we measure training stimulus better? Because I think that if people understand what the bottlenecks are in a training program, there are enough tools and equipment now to really optimize and maximize your training. It's a diagnostic problem where what is this particular athlete's response to training stimuli? And the faster you can figure out how to relate the two, that's why when I saw on Instagram, Mike T just dropped an AI platform, I was like, hey, that is really the disruption we need, is that if we can figure out how to utilize technology and it doesn't take 32 years, maybe it takes 18 months, you get 4 or 5 cycles of training in, can we train and automate a system and use data and big data to really look at outcomes and tailor personalized. This is the most effective training program for this particular individuals. And it's based off of real training data and outcomes. And then that machine gets reinforced over time. And in 4 years, okay, let's say you have this 14-year-old or 16-year-old, they train for 4 years onto that. And the machine is just constantly reinforced with all that data. And when they enter the 10, 12-year period where they're in like their peak physical condition and mental condition, are we going to see the next generation of power athletes or just athletes in general? I think that, to me, that is the biggest disruption that can come during our time now. And anyone knows that's in engineering or data analytics is that the success of that type of approach in data analytics and big data is the quality of the data. And I think that the more data that you can feed this critical data and good data that is tied to the outcomes and performance metrics you want to see on the other end, the more you feed into that machine, the more it can understand nuance and tailor that personalized training program for each individual athlete. So looking at, again, our sensor system and our analytics fit into this. It's just it's a pipeline that feeds in data into this type of machine. Is, can we measure the best intensities, volume, frequencies, and loads at a given point in time for a particular athlete? I think that's really the setup for the next disruption in the strength space.
Yeah, man, I think there's a lot to say about that, but we're getting close to our time limit here. And before we get too close to it, I wanted to get your inputs on, what do you see as the basic utility of oral muscles for a powerlifter or powerlifting coach? Like, one thing you've mentioned a couple times that I think bears some more expanding would be this idea of diagnostics. That would be interesting, and kind of anything else that you've thought of in that area as well.
I think the lowest hanging fruit is actually just exactly what you said, is calibrating someone's training to what they need. And so if you have these training goals and you define with your coach that, okay, these are the training stimuli that I think are going to make me successful, our system and our analytics can validate that, hey, this is actually the training stimuli that is actually happening in your program. And you can adjust that training program based on that data. And so if you think that, hey, with Kabuki and the work that we've done with you, it's like, are these movements really specific to my training goal? That was a very basic question. And that's actually probably the basic question that this is the first question we try to answer for anybody that we work with is this movement actually useful for my competition movement? That's the first lowest hanging fruit. And then from there, then people ask, okay, so we find these specific movements that we do near peaking cycles, and then these non-specific movements where we can use for GPP, how many reps and sets should we do with those? Then it comes down to load monitoring. It's okay, now we can jump really into the data and look at, okay, when you do this workout, this is the work duration, these are the intensities. It's just essentially saying, okay, this is how much. It's almost like tonnage, but for each of your muscles. So you get very specific data to really figure out and fine tune your programs to ensure that you are getting the training stimulus that you think that you're getting.
Man, it's really fascinating. And our tools around this area, especially as it relates to compound lifts, are just so blunt. The idea that you do a set of bench press, it's going to affect your chest differently than your triceps and your front delts. And a set of squats, like, each of the muscles gets a different training stimulus from that. And it matters your individual technique, strengths and weaknesses, and things like that. Modeling that appropriately, figuring out where you might apply a greater training volume, or where should you target your assistance work. I think building it on a better fundamental assumption of the load that those systems are undergoing at any given time, you would be in such a better position to make training decisions, because you have a better understanding of the current situation. It's hard to know, like, how many sets and reps should I do is the best question and the worst question at the same time. It's like this question that is so obvious, and we start asking it like our first day in the gym, and there's no good answers to it after 25 years in the gym. It's this arbitrary thing that gets passed down from lifter to lifter, and we tweak it a little bit and experiment here and there. And as time has gone on, we started to shed a little bit more light on it. And I would say my understanding of actually legitimate answer to that question now is a lot better than it ever has been before. But still, there's going to be layers that you can go down. You can go take this thing deeper. And again, I think the more thoroughly you can understand your starting position and how the system is going to react when you give it an additional set of squats versus an additional set of leg press, that stuff adds up, and it has to matter. And look, I'm with you. I think that's going to be an improvement for anyone's performance who can make use of that kind of information.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think going back to the days that I was lifting, it's like you go into the gym, after 2 years, 3 years, you exhaust all your beginner gains. You have to change up the training stimulus to get outside of plateaus. But I think a lot of lifters, they turn to coaches. Like if you're serious about powerlifting, you turn to a coach once you've exhausted everything that you know how to do and to get through plateaus. And should I do leg press? Is that going to drive my squat up? Is it counter movement jumps? Is it proprioception stuff? Is it one-legged squats? And plus now you see so much stuff on Instagram. It's okay, what do I trust? What do I not trust? And so this tool allows you to actually look at the training stimulus between, okay, these are all the different things. And this is actually how they're all different. Because right now it's okay, Bulgarian split squats, leg press, belt squats, box squats. If you ask the average lifter, they would say, okay, these are all accessory movements for squat and they all build legs, but they wouldn't know, okay, when do I use each of them? And I think the answer changes for each lifter based on biomechanics, based on your previous sports history, just your how you move. So I think that's a very complex question indeed. It's not only reps and sets, but what movements for reps and sets. And now you have a tool that you can actually see all the diversity, and it's like a number. It's not just like a qualitative assessment. It's a number where you can assign, okay, this is this specific to my competition movement, and it has this intensity at these loads and volumes. And so we're not really telling you what to do. It's now you have the information to make that decision for yourself. If you're trying to train a maximal strength, then okay, you're probably looking for this type of intensity, this type of volume, and these kind of movements. If you're trying to train for power, like a kind of like a hybrid between endurance and maximal strength, okay, these movements look much maybe more fruitful in the training stimulus you're looking for this competition movement. And then for endurance, let's do those. You hear people doing crazy stuff. Should you be doing heavy deadlifts for marathon runners? Okay. The elite Japanese marathon team is doing heavy deadlifts at altitude. Does that mean you should be doing heavy deadlifts at altitude when you're trying to run your next marathon? So I think it just depends on how do you respond to that. And now we have a tool to actually give you a picture of that instead of just relying on the be like Mike model.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Look, I think there's a lot more to discuss here too, and I always enjoy our conversations, but I think we can leave it at that for now. If anybody wants to learn more about Oro Muscles, wants to get in touch with you, how should they best go about doing that?
Yeah, they can visit our website, oromuscles.com, or they can visit us on Instagram and just send us a message. And we're on that pretty religiously, and we reply to people. And I think that we're actively recruiting pilot sites to learn more on how to reduce user friction. So how can we get to those numbers in the least amount of clicks and effort possible? And so if you're interested in being a pilot site or trying out our system, don't hesitate to contact us through Instagram or our website, www.oromuscles.com, and sign up to be a pilot site. We're really willing to work with anybody who is trying to really improve and bring data to the forefront of strength sports.
Awesome. That's ORO Muscles. Yes. Thanks again, man. Thanks for a great conversation. Thanks everyone for listening and watching, and we'll see you
next time. Thanks for having me.